we get your reaction to the Alex Petti incident?
One right here.
Can we get your reaction to the Alex Petti incident over the weekend?
Yeah. We're going to have hearings on this. We've invited three of the prominent leaders from the Department of Human Services on immigration and immigration control, and we're going to discuss the question of whether or not filming someone, as I see is going on right now, whether that could be considered to be assault, whether retreating from ICE agents is considered to be assault, and whether or not filming and then retreating is an indication that you're a potential assassin. We can't just say, oh, nothing to see here, and he was obviously an assassin and a domestic terrorist. When we say things like that, it leads to no confidence in, so I think there really has to be an independent investigation.
That was Rand Paul, the Republican senator from Kentucky, and he was in a gaggle with a lot of press who wanted to know what he was going to do as chair of Homeland Security in relation to the shootings in Minneapolis. That's what we're going to be talking about again today. I'm Claire Potter.
I'm Neil J. Young.
And this is the Ice Out of Minnesota edition of the Political Junkie Substack. And Neil, it's really cold down there in Florida, isn't it?
It's freezing. I mean, I know I shouldn't say it to folks who are like literally below zero, but we've been in the 30s here in Central Florida. We've been in the 30s for a lot of January. I mean, like 30s to 50s. So, but I mean, we start the day and we end the day in the 30s. This weekend it's getting down to the 20s. And there's actually snow flurries predicted just north of here, which, you know, is not a frequent event in Central Florida, but it can happen time to time. But yeah, we're cold. Yeah.
Well, let me just tell you, this morning at 6 o'clock when I was out walking the dog in the dark, it was -1.
That's a little chillier.
It is very chilly. And I have gotten to the point where I don't even look at the temperature anymore. I just don't want to know. And I want to know when I come back in to find out what I have endured. All right. So, Neil.
It's like me with the news.
Right, exactly. All right, so we're going to start with a few little items that are in the news that have caught my attention. And the first one is the skyrocketing cost of silver. There's really nothing that says investor jitters like the skyrocketing cost of gold, but now silver is sort of outpacing gold. The New York Times reported this week that precious metal investment is due to Trump's tariff policies and the uncertainties of Europe's pivot away from trade with the United States and towards India, which is really interesting. But what else is going on, Neil?
Well, you know, China is choking off their silver exports. So that's part of this. So, I mean, the metal is obviously important to a lot of technologies. It's really crucial to AI infrastructure because it can be used to conduct electricity. Elon Musk has weighed in on this, as you know, he's wont to do, and saying like this is bad. But you know, I became aware of this because my mom has brought up twice this past week that she's going to go sell off some gold because, you know, a friend of hers had just sold like an old class ring and gotten like, you know, a couple $1,000s for it. And I thought, if this is making the rounds sort of anecdotally among my mom's friends, this must be, this is not good, right? This is not a good moment in history when gold spikes like this. We know this from other moments in history.
Right. Well, and gold is now, I think, at about $5,000 an ounce, but silver has always been the populist metal. I mean, William Jennings Bryan, I will not be crucified upon a cross of gold and all of that. But silver was really the cheap precious metal. But as it turns out, it is as or more important to AI technology than any other precious metal. And so China, I mean, who knows if they're doing this to try to force Trump to the table. And I think a number of countries are beginning to realize that the way to Trump is through the technology industry, whether they're just sort of playing with us or whether it's a real move to take over the AI sector. And if so, could be working.
Yeah. Seems like a little of both. It's interesting that you point out that technology is a sector by which Trump seems to get engaged. Do you have a theory around that? Is that like the influence of Musk? Like, what's happening there?
I think it's partly the influence of Musk. I think also the tech sector has given a ton of money to him. They have done a lot to support his various vanity projects. And the tech sector basically seems to be almost apolitical at this point, that they will work for the people who work for them, and they will pivot when they need to. I mean, the tech sector was all behind Biden too, and now what are they doing?
Sure.
You know, we've got people like Tim Cook, who's in and out of the White House and doesn't seem to be able to take any kind of a moral stand on anything. So I think there's a little game being played here between the administration and the tech sector. It's also just true that they need a lot from the public in order to push their various projects forward. And they really don't want to be investigated by the Justice Department. I mean, really, a major antitrust investigation has been looming over them for years. It occasionally comes to court. They occasionally settle. I think TikTok has recently settled its piece of the tech addiction lawsuit. So there's 4 more companies who are still in court negotiating with Trump over whether they deliberately addict all of us to tech. Yes, they do. So I think really, the tech sector and the government are so intertwined. And if we look back to the origins of the internet, of course, they always have been.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So in other news, on Wednesday, FBI agents searched an Atlanta election office that was at the center of Donald Trump's claim that he won Fulton County, Georgia in 2020, or rather, at the center of his beautiful phone call that he made to the governor of Georgia and the Secretary of State, saying that he only needed 11,883 votes or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So agents have seized all the ballots cast in that year's election, and Trump continues to pivot back to this business of the election being rigged. Now, apparently, the Justice Department is saying that members of Georgia's state election board asked for an intervention. They're calling it a civil rights investigation. I mean, everything is just so crazy. But coincidentally, the FBI special agent in charge in Atlanta was relieved of his duties just last week. Neil, this seems so worrisome. And is there any way to imagine that someone in the Republican Party is going to put a stop to this?
It's very worrisome, and no, I don't think there's any way to imagine that this is going to be stopped for a number of reasons. One, because folks in the Republican Party don't stop what Trump does in general, although we have a little bit of an asterisk on that this week, which we'll get into. But this is certainly not an issue that they're pushing back on. There's huge concerns about the midterms, rightly so, from Republicans, that they're about to get shellacked. I think everything we've seen from this administration and from Trump himself is not about like improving messaging, changing policy directions, you know, sort of the bread and butter stuff that politicians do to, you know, gin up support. It's this electioneering, and it's intimidation and political retribution. And I think this is very troubling. Tulsi Gabbard's involved in this, which is completely inappropriate for her role as not an SI director. And sort of the gross politicization of that role and that agency. And so lots of bad things happening here. But to answer your question, no, I don't think a Republican is going to put any brakes on this.
Well, and one of the things I'm seeing as a kind of long trend, and it's impossible to imagine that we've actually only been in this for a year. It feels like we've been in this for a decade. But a long trend seems to be the Trump people taking control of a lot of sensitive data that they're not entitled to.
Uh-huh.
That's what was happening with Doge. It is what is happening with the Georgia State Election Board. It is apparently one of the things on the table that Tom Homan is trying to negotiate to pull troops out of Minneapolis, is to get all of the voter records from the state of Minnesota, which they are simply not entitled to. Elections are run by the state.
Yeah, and also that it just I mean, well, we're going to talk about this more, but that just exposes the sham of what ICE is doing in Minnesota. That a negotiating point is handing over election data. Like, those two things are not connected at all. It just shows you the strong arm approach that Trump and his minions take in this. But yeah, I mean, lots of troubling aspects to this, and also just like the clear evidence of just the corruption of this administration and its and the ends that it will go to retain power.
Yeah, and of course, one of the things I've seen bouncing around X this week is a group of influencers talking about the population drops in blue states, and they are attributing some of this population drop to immigrants self-deporting and the deportation of immigrants by the administration. One of the things it kind of looks like, and I've seen people talking again about this falsehood that immigrants are voting all over the country and Democrats want immigrants here to puff up their numbers. But it does seem plausible to me that getting rid of immigrants, the one place that immigrants really, really count if they're not citizens is in the census. And census figures determine electoral college votes. And one of the things that I'm seeing influencers doing is crowing about this projection that by 2030, there will be dramatically fewer electoral college votes in blue states, and that this will lead to a permanent Republican majority.
Because this is being only pursued in blue states, right? Like, that's the point, right? And I saw, and I'm not going to get the numbers exactly, but I saw some data this week that, Minnesota has something like 150, 160,000 undocumented aliens in the state compared to several million in Florida and Texas. So it's not about immigration. It's about using immigration as a tool through which to pursue this electoral advantage, right? Like, this is being targeted in part for political retribution to Democratic leaders in those places and to against voters there, but also in terms of, changing the population of these places for those very reasons at the same time that it's not in red states.
Right. Well, all right, on to our next issue, which is just as depressing. The war on trans people continues and has sort of been pushed to the margins of the news by all of the horrors in Minneapolis. But nevertheless, if you go looking, the Trump administration is still at it. This week, Utah moved to enacting a complete ban on gender-affirming care for minors. They had issued a pause on it, and now they're taking steps to make that pause permanent. And the Trump administration has found San Jose State in California in violation of Title IX for allowing a trans woman to play on the women's volleyball team between 2022 and 2024. Neil, what is wrong with this picture?
Well, I'm actually a little bit... Am I wrong to think that the trans issue has fallen away in terms of... I guess it hasn't fallen away because we see the efforts like this taking place. But I wonder, are American voters caught up with this in the way that they were a year and a half ago? And that's, of course, not the only reason we should care about this or be talking about this, but I'm thinking here from the perspective of the sort of political strategy on the part of Trump administration and conservatives around this. I mean, I don't know that voters care about this stuff today. And again, there are other reasons to pursue things that don't have to do with whether or not voters care about them. But I'm struck by how much the trans issue, or how much Republicans made trans issues a big part of the 2024 campaign, how it feels like the American people aren't necessarily caught up in that as much these days, and yet the war on trans people continues, as you said.
Well, I guess there are two things. I think you're making some really good points here. I don't think the American people are as caught up in it, and I think it might be one of those ironic moments where, because the Trump administration so profoundly intimidated so many institutions and has marginalized trans people to the extent that they have, that trans people have kind of become much more invisible. Trans people were hyper visible before, as you were saying, and now they've become much less visible. I think they don't want to call attention to themselves. I think, a variety of lawsuits are progressing. But I think the other thing that we're seeing here with San Jose State is that using the trans issue retrospectively. I mean, let's look. Between 2022 and 2024, there was no federal guidance about not allowing trans women to play in women's sports. Therefore, San Jose State was not in violation of Title IX during those years. And so it seems like the trans issue is something that is now totally detached from actual trans people and just becomes another thing that if the administration is going after an institution, particularly a public institution, and they go to the gym and sort of see who was on that championship team, it becomes another thing to just sort of twist in the side of that university's administration. And I would have to say the failure of universities to take a stand on this and the failure of Democrats to come up with some kind of coherent policy directive that is an alternative to excluding all trans people from competitive athletics is really a scandal. And it is one of those things that we're going to look back on 20 or 30 years from now, and it's going to seem a lot like McCarthyism.
Well, I think Democrats want this to go away, frankly. I think they don't want to come up with a response to this. I think they're sort of hoping it will go away. And in some ways, they may be getting what they want. I think institutions are something different. As you point out, universities could be figuring out an alternative path, some sort of resistance to this. I don't think they're very well positioned to really resist all that much here. But there's probably variations of this that might look like not total compliance. Yeah, I think 20 to 30 years from now, we'll know a lot about this moment that we don't know right now. I do think the visibility point you made is enormous and really important here because, of course, visibility around vulnerable folks is always an important part of gaining sort of rights and power and a sort of place at the table, if you will. But I think that so much of this has been about suppressing the visibility of LGBTQ folks, particularly of queer and trans persons. And there's been a real success around that, as you've pointed out, that is incredibly consequential.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, one of the things I'm wondering, and here I'm just spitballing a little bit, is I wonder if one of the outcomes of this for parents is going to be to actually transition their children earlier. The guidance from most professionals is to slow walk gender transition and to, unless a child is absolutely insisting on it at a very early age, that you take things slowly, you go with a name change, you go with pronoun change, you let your little person who was born a boy to start wearing pink pony stuff and see how that goes over. And are they comfortable in this new form of gender expression? I do wonder whether slamming the door on all kinds of futures for trans people is going to say to parents, all right, what we need to do is we need to move to a new state. We need a new identity. We need to have this child have absolutely no history in the other gender, in the gender they were assigned at birth, and construct a complete and full biography in the gender that they are comfortable being in. And, whether this is going to produce something that Republicans claim that they never wanted, which was early transition, permanent transition, and a kind of rush to change that has really not been part of the guidance for children. I know that's a totally without evidence, but honestly, if I had a kid who was 4 or 5 and saying they wanted to transition, I might say, okay, we need to do this and we need to do this fast before your entire life is defined by this. Anyway, all right, so let's move on to something, we'll go from the tragic to the macabre here. This week, Amazon's Melania documentary debuts in theaters across the nation tomorrow, Friday. And I just want to say, listeners, I wanted Neil to go to this tomorrow, and I would go to it tomorrow, and then we would come and dish it. And he like totally shamed me around giving Melania money. So we're putting off our commentary on Melania for another month until it drops for free on streaming, which we already pay for.
Well,
is that not correct? Yeah.
I wasn't going to bring that up, but since you have, yes, I took the principled stand that I did not want to put $8 into that trough. I actually have to say and I also just didn't like want to go to a movie theater and do it. It felt like I know like reporters do this all the time. Like you go to things you don't endorse, you're there as a, you know, but it just feels like going into a movie theater with folks feels a little bit like, you know, you're voting with your butt in the seat in a way, and I didn't want to do that. So I will stream it as soon as I can, although that will also be, you know, a tick in the box for them. But yeah, I did not want to I did not want to support my local movie theater this way. And I was happy to see on Twitter today there was these screenshots of like movie theaters in Boston where there's not a single ticket that's sold. That may not be the case here in Central Florida, but Boston is holding strong.
So there are a number of things to talk about with the Melania documentary. One being that actually movie theaters are really struggling. This is probably not the vehicle to bring Americans back to the movie theater. First of all, documentaries aren't very popular. Second of all, I don't think Melania Trump is very popular. I mean, she's really less of a feature, even for MAGA people, than Donald Trump. She's rarely around. I don't think people are going to go just to worship her. So there's that. But there's some other sort of backstage things to point to here, Neil. For example, Ebony Boykin Patterson at the Daily Beast. And the Daily Beast always has all kinds of garbage that you don't really want to read. But every once in a while, they come up with something really important. Apparently, most of the New York documentary crew requested that their names not be added to the film's credits. So there are all these people who actually worked on the film who don't want their names attached to it. Have you ever heard of that before?
I mean, I'm sure there's other examples we could think of, but like I totally appreciate that, you know, folks in this line of work needed the paycheck, you know, need a job, but like don't want that on the resume.
Right.
So I'm glad that they even had that as an option.
Right. Okay, so the director is a guy named Brett Ratner, who apparently is just a Class A POS. And he hasn't made a film since he was accused of sexual assault in 2017. Obviously, the film was a complete rush job, and the crew members said that while Melania was sort of a lovely person and she was nice to everybody, Brett Ratner is a horrible human being. He's personally unclean, he's rude, and he sort of drops garbage all over the place. Somebody has to follow him around, like picking up all of his candy wrappers and stuff like that.
I can't imagine why he was chosen for this project.
I know. There must be a whole lineup of people who've been accused of sexual assault who are sending their resumes in to Donald Trump. I guess, of course, he was available. But the crew members also said there's no there. They said, you know, Melania was perfectly nice to everyone, but she didn't reveal anything. She's a totally private person. She remains a totally private person. So the movie is sort of all style and no substance. But here's some interesting news. South Africa has completely canceled the film's release, and they won't say why. And at the same time, Trump issued a proclamation, this is my favorite part, on Truth Social, that Melania is the greatest film ever made, and he has issued this proclamation that it will now be required viewing in all history classes. What are we supposed to do with this, Neil?
Well, back to South Africa really quickly, because when I saw this in the reading notes, I was like, how could a government... It's not that the government has barred this from playing. It's right. The distributor, like so the lone sort of film distributor for the country has said that, who operates in the country, has said they won't be distributing it for unspecified reasons, and which everyone is like, well, what could those reasons be? And it's like, folks, just pick up the news and point to everything. Yeah, Trump calling this the greatest movie ever made reminds me of him, you know, declaring that his own book, what is it, The Art of the Deal, was the greatest book ever written, except, of course, the Bible. So we know that Trump, although I would think on movies as opposed to books, Trump has a much bigger record of like having, you know, watched things. So
Yes.
Surely there's a film or two that he enjoyed more than Melania. I mean, this is what Trump says. But like this declaration that this is going to be shown everywhere, like,
Right.
I get it
Right.
that we're not supposed to take him literally, or at least that's what his supporters say, but what's going to happen with this? I mean, are they just going to pretend he never said this? Like, is there any version of this that actually happens?
Well, I think Melania is always pretending that he's not talking. But one of the things Michael Wolff said about this is that everybody knows that the only person who can really get through to Donald Trump, other than the people on Fox News as he's watching them on television, is Melania. And that she is really pissed off that this whole thing in Minneapolis has sullied her movie release. That this week was supposed to be all about
Terrible timing.
Melania's movie.
Hate when
And
that
then
happens.
these jagoffs in Minnesota like totally harsh her vibe, and so that she's really angry, and so Trump has sort of stepped in to boost it a little bit. The other thing that I've been thinking about, and I'm actually going to read the Truth Social post, which is the kind of thing I never do, Neil, but it is worth reading. In celebration of my incredible wife, Melanie, and her brand new movie, critics are calling it very important. That's in quotes. I am proud to announce that it will now be considered a foundational moment in American history. That's all in caps. Effective immediately, this movie will be mandatory, capital letters, mandatory viewing in all history courses, elementary, high school, college, everyone. People should learn winning early. Any universities that refuse to teach this masterpiece will unfortunately see their funding disappear. Sad, but rules are rules. This is about education. This is about culture. This is about respect. Congratulations to Melania, he got it right this time, on this historic achievement. Many people are saying it's the greatest film since the invention of film.
Okay, I've said this before, but it really bears repeating right now. This is the campiest MFer who has ever inhabited the White House. Like, go
It's
off
so true.
clean. Go off.
It's so true. And, I found this on X because somebody had posted a screenshot of it and with the quote line saying, "Who's Melanie?"
Indeed.
So anyway, that's where we are, Neil, with all this. But the last thing I want to say about this is, do you remember something called Mad Libs that we used to play when we were
Mad Libs.
kids?
Yes, of course.
Yes, it was great. It was like before the internet, we had Mad Libs. And for those of you who don't know Mad Libs, there would be a story, but there would be all these blanks. And basically, your friend would help you write the story because you would say, okay, now I need a noun. Now I need a verb, blah, blah, blah. And you would fill in all these random words and then read the story. And it was always hilarious. And so this Truth Social post seems like a Mad Lib. And I think whoever does the first Mad Libs book of Donald Trump is going to make millions and millions of dollars. It will be the greatest Mad Lib ever published.
That's a genius idea. You should do that ASAP.
I know. Maybe we should do it. Political junkie Mad Libs.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's pivot to our news focus. And we're returning to Minneapolis this week. I just want to make a little shout out to my nieces in Minneapolis, Charlotte and Lucy, who are like the most fabulous young women with the most fabulous parents. And they are such courageous and wonderful kids. So I just want to say hi to them and tell them that the whole family is so proud of how they've been handling the last couple weeks. We love you to death and we're incredibly proud of you. Neil doesn't know you and even he's proud of you. But today we want to sort of weave in a story of the MAGA coalition kind of cracking up about the Second Amendment. And I want to make sure we tell the story in a way that makes sense to our audience. But most people know the story of Alex Petti's murder and Renee Good's murder at this point. But Petti's murder was slightly different in that he was armed. He came to the protest with a gun. He was licensed to carry that weapon. Minnesota is an open carry state. And one of the things that the Homeland Security people said about him was that he shouldn't have been carrying the gun. And the reason he had to be shot was because he brandished the weapon at the agents. Of course, that was not true. And just to let listeners know, brandishing a weapon is actually a legal term. It means you take it out, you point it at someone, you wave it around, you are basically threatening to use the weapon. And that's actually very, very different from just wearing it clipped to your belt. Okay, so on the one hand, Jamel Bouie of the New York Times has said, these murders could be the Trump administration's Gettysburg moment. Putting the gun issue aside for a second, Neil, what does Jamel mean by the Gettysburg moment?
Well, this moment of things falling apart. Well, I don't know. I thought, what did you think? I haven't read Jamel's piece, so I'm just hearing this now. But I mean, this is the moment that the war falls apart. What's he saying there?
Yeah, I think so. So one of the, it's interesting that the Civil War metaphors keep sort of coming back in. But one of the features of Gettysburg is that it was a surprise. General Lee marched on Pennsylvania, marched into the heart of the Union, and actually did it very, very swiftly, became embedded and entrenched around Gettysburg. In those days, when you had a war, basically everybody would sort of assemble their troops in advance. It was very 19th century.
Yes.
You would assemble your troops, everybody would get ready, and then somebody would attack, right? But you waited until everybody was there, which I actually just find fascinating. But the fact that Lee sort of cut through the various local militias in Maryland and Delaware and Pennsylvania like a hot knife through butter was terrifying to people. And it was his bid to force the Union to sue for peace and let the Confederacy go. But he lost. And Gettysburg turned out to be a disaster for the Confederacy, but nobody really knew it at the time. And it was a moment in which various forms of ingenious maneuvering and then the unbelievable bravery of the Wisconsin troops, Union troops, at Little Round Top meant that Lee was turned around. But nobody knew at that moment that it was the beginning of the end for the Confederacy, right? And so I think that's what Bouie is talking about, that this is a moment in which all of the troops were in place. There's a variety of maneuvers going on. People are sort of poking at each other's defenses. And then actually the Trump administration is withdrawing to some degree, and we won't really know yet. But I think Bouie is saying this could be the turning point in which everything really starts to fall apart for them. And that it has something to do with a big part of their coalition who are Second Amendment supporters coming out and saying, no, Alex Petti had every right to be at that protest with a gun.
Yeah, I think certainly a lot of the events, even more recently, that we've seen would align with that thesis, right? Like that, it's more evidence for that, including the president himself seeming to want this to be over with and not. He's leaning sort of away from it as opposed to into it, because he apparently spent the weekend watching TV in a sort of really concerned and agitated state that this wasn't playing out. And I think with Trump, you either see him double down on something or run away from it, particularly if it's people he's married to. And so this feels like, from what we're seeing, him just wanting to move away from this. I think he's making some moves in terms of personnel that are indicative, again, of that are evidence, again, that prop up that thesis. I mean, there's been other moments that we've pointed to over and over again in the last year of we can see sort of cracks emerging, right? But that's what we were looking for, I think, for so long. We're little tiny cracks. And then it seems like those get smoothed over, in a new news cycle. This does feel really different. And I don't know if this is what pulls everything apart, but to take on the gun lobby and to take on the Second Amendment from within a Republican administration feels like a really risky move, really dumb, and certainly exposing some big divisions that I think are only made more stark by all the challenges that this administration already had.
Yes, I think you're right about that. And I think this has stalled. The Petti murder has stalled in the way Renee Good's murder didn't. Renee Good's murder, because there were so many different video angles involved, because there were so many questions about, Did she bump him? Did she not bump him? What camera angles mattered? What camera angles were actually distorting it? In the case of Pretti's murder, they have some pretty clear proof of the administration's lies. It's perfectly clear from the video that he was holding a camera and not a gun. It is perfectly clear from the video that what led the Border Patrol agent to assault him in the first place was that he was trying to help somebody, a woman, who had already been assaulted by the Border Patrol. It was perfectly clear that they had him on the ground. Somebody comes over and pepper sprays him in the face, and then he's shot. And actually, I think somebody got on their video an agent saying he's carrying a gun, but then you can see them extracting the gun from his waistband. And so these lies were built upon by people like Kristi Noem and, people around Stephen Miller, yes. And they called him a terrorist, they called him an assassin, and so on. And it was just like the whole balloon popped for certain kinds of people, many of whom are Republicans in Congress.
Yes, I do think like the needle that made that balloon pop, though, was not all that clear evidence you just pointed out, combined with the lies of the administration, as much as it was the unforced error of the way they spoke about Pretti's Second Amendment rights, right? Like, that's the thing that's the new circumstance of this particular scenario that's actually mobilizing the response. So I think we could imagine a very, like, the same event, but without him carrying, legally carrying a gun, and without the administration saying, well, who brings a gun to a protest? Like, that not happening, but the same exact events playing out, and Republicans wouldn't be speaking out. I think what has been activated here is a defense of the Second Amendment that this Republican administration has put into motion. And so it feels like a huge unforced error, in addition to everything else you said about just like the basic facts of this. But I think Republicans are speaking out because they think that this like sacrosanct principle has been infringed by a sitting Republican president.
Yeah, and it's numerous gun groups. There is a gun group in Minnesota, but also the NRA. I mean, the NRA are not our friends, Neil, and yet somehow they have managed to pull themselves together. Now, it's worth saying that none of these groups stood up for Philando Castile when he was shot back in, when was it, 2016? Yeah, 2016. For our listeners who don't remember Philando Castile, he was shot by a Minneapolis policeman, a Latino policeman, in fact, not a white policeman. He was stopped because of a broken taillight, supposedly, and of course that's an old story with black drivers. He was stopped driving while black. He was a beloved school custodian, I think, and when the officer came to his window, he said very clearly to the officer, "I have a gun in the car." And the officer shot him, and he was licensed to carry that weapon. So none of the pro-Second Amendment groups came out to defend Philando Castile. So I just want to stipulate that. The other thing that is sort of bothering me here a little bit is that, of course, Alex Petti is a white man. Renee Good is a white woman, a lesbian. I feel like there is some imbalance on the desire to defend Petti, really a full-throated defense of Good as well. But perhaps I'm being too sensitive.
I don't think you're being sensitive at all. I think I've had that same feeling that Petti is getting, some additional points here because he's a man, or rather that Good had those points subtracted from her by being a woman, by being a lesbian. Like those things were weaponized pretty quickly, as they always are. And I think, he's benefiting from just like all the ways that the patriarchy benefits white men in general, even when they're, there's lots of reasons why, they might be like conservatives would go after them. I do think he sort of benefits here from being a white man. And I think it's also significant to bring in the conversation of Philando Castile into this as well. So all of that stipulated, I think he is the sort of figure in this scenario that is more likely than others to get the Second Amendment folks to rally behind him for all those sorts of different reasons of race and gender, and the ways those are particularly privileged here. So I think, yeah, that's at work as well.
Yeah, and of course, these Second Amendment groups are also very highly focused on men as protectors and defenders, much less so on women taking that role. And the idea of Petti being there as a protector and a defender, I think, is doing a lot of work. But, it got me thinking, Neil, about Democrats and gun ownership. And there is this kind of, I realize my own prejudice of thinking, well, liberals don't want guns. They don't need guns. They don't like guns. And statistically, a great many more Republicans and Republican-leaning independents own guns than Democrats. But there's a not insignificant number of Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents who own guns. And can we dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's sort of share some stats here, because I honestly was surprised by a lot of these numbers, Claire, that we got from Pew Research. So 40% of Americans live in a household with a gun. I find that to be a really high number myself. Yeah. 40% of Americans live in a household with a gun. 32% personally own one. Basically, 1 in 3 Americans owns a gun. I just find that surprising.
Right.
Around 45% of Republicans and GOP-leaning Republicans personally own a gun, as opposed to 20% of Democrats and Democratic Party leaners. 20% might be a number that surprises folks in terms of Democrats. I actually don't find that number all that surprising. 38% of white Americans own one, 24% of black Americans, 40% of men, 25% of women, 72%, this is not surprising at all, 72% of gun owners say they own the gun for personal protection. I'm surprised that number's not higher, although I suppose there's a lot of sports enthusiast hunters who that's the only reason, that's sort of the core of their gun identity. 20% of adults who live in cities own a gun. That's sort of fascinating to me, as opposed to 47% who live in rural areas, like people out there and 30% in the suburbs.
Yeah.
71% of gun owners say they like having one in the home. I think this is fascinating. So 71% of gun owners say they like having one in the home, but only 30% of the people who live with them say they like it being in the gun. I mean, that feels also like a huge, probably gender divide on this question.
Yep. Yeah, and 40% of Democrats who do not own a gun actually are beginning to imagine the idea of owning one in the future. And that almost jives with the 52% of Republicans who are not gun owners who can imagine them owning one in the future. So it looks like we might be looking at these numbers growing, and particularly growing among liberals and Democrats. Now, I have to say, the way I was raised, nobody had guns for personal protection. They had guns to hunt. They secured them in locked cabinets. The sort of fetishized celebration of weapons that has arisen primarily on the right is just kind of appalling to me, and I think would have been appalling to all the gun owners that I grew up with. And we were constantly told guns are not toys. There were a lot of families in southern Idaho, where I partly grew up, that wouldn't give their children toy guns. So strongly did they feel that guns were not toys.
Oh,
Whereas,
wow.
We in the suburbs of Philadelphia had our little cowboy guns with, sticky caps on them and stuff like that. But it seems like, I'm surprised that 1 in 4 women own a gun. Where are they keeping them?
Yeah. Are these the small guns that you take in your purse somewhere?
I guess so.
There have been lots of articles in the last decade or so about gun buying rates skyrocketing in particular moments among women. In some ways, it's really understandable that women would want to have self-protection in this world, right?
Yes.
I also think that if we broaden our historical lens here, which we should do as historians, right? And we sort of remember that the NRA has been around for a really long time, but the NRA went through an enormous politicization of itself just a couple decades back that really transformed it as an organization, and also I think radically altered what gun ownership meant in this country, and sort of making it highly identified with partisan politics and a particular identity that was increasingly political over those decades since, in a way that, like, you know, used to be Black Panthers were enormous owners of guns and were sort of like a visible group in America as gun owners. Like, I wrote in my book about these gun toting homosexuals in San Francisco, rather, in the 1960s, and they were doing it because it was an act of self-protection. So there were like really different groups of folks that I think we don't think of as gun owners, who had a strong attachment to the right to own guns and that believed that they needed to do that. And so that's really changed over the last couple of decades. But I don't know. I mean, I just think sort of broadening that historical framework maybe helps us have some insight into some of the data we're seeing here, particularly around Democrats and the sort of maybe surprising statistics about how many Democrats own guns and how many Democrats say they might want to own guns soon.
Right. And of course, there is this kind of specter of, like, you know, what if society really falls apart?
Right.
And what do we do then? It's not altogether clear to me that owning a gun is going to help anyone if society falls apart. But that is an aside. I do think what's interesting to me, and I would love it if somebody in his family would speak out about this. Why did Alex Petti own a gun? I mean, the man was an ICU nurse. Mm-hmm. And yet he was attending these protests. He was at a protest the week before in which he kicked out the taillight of a federal agent's car, and they got out of the car and threw him to the ground, but then they drove away. Well, apparently he was wearing a gun then, too. So why was he wearing a gun to nonviolent protests? Why did he own a gun in the first place? I would like to know more about that story, because I think it might tell us a little bit of something about how liberalism is changing, or who imagines himself as a progressive now, and how close are we to progressives organizing in some ways that we have in the past attributed mostly to the right.
Well, that's a really good question. And I'd love to, I mean, it'll be really fascinating to see if that gets reported out. You know, it's maybe worth remembering that he worked at a VA hospital. So I don't know if there's maybe some sort of connection there. And I don't believe he had his own military service, but maybe there was a sense that he needed, you know, additional protection for himself because of certain clientele he was working with. I don't know. I do think, though, because we are in a moment in which we are seeing a really fascinating discourse evolve from the right, as they're trying to thread the needle of this.
Yep.
One of the things that's happening, and you're seeing this a lot online, is all these sort of speculation about Petti being mentally unstable, and like lots and lots of rumors getting spread. I think most of them have been sort of knocked down, but that doesn't mean they're not, you know, really sort of grabbing audiences online. But to position himself as really mentally unstable, as unhinged and all that, if the Trump administration takes that on, and if there's legislation that goes forward around mental instability or health and gun ownership, I mean, you want to finish the sentence for me, Claire? But I mean, all the ways that this has been invoked in other crisis moments, and there's been no movement around these sort of issues in terms of any sort of regulation. If this is the administration that brings some sort of like major gun control about because of this, I mean, they're starting to say it in different ways, but I don't know. Like, is there a possibility here that like that becomes the story about Petti? He was an unhinged, unstable actor, and these sorts of folks should not have access to guns.
Yeah, you know, I was reading an article by Erwin Chemerinsky on SCOTUS blog in which he was talking about the fact that gun laws, Second Amendment laws, have largely been made in the courts, not in Congress or state houses. And of course, Congress and state houses have liberalized gun ownerships, and they put restrictions on the capacity of states and localities to control gun ownership. But basically, we are governed by a very haphazard group of court decisions. And that this is part of what makes it possible for this Alex Petti moment to be so incoherent in relation to Second Amendment groups and the Trump administration. I agree with you that if, in fact, Republicans say we are going to move forward with legislation that says you're not allowed to bring a gun to a protest, which is basically what Pam Bondi and Kristi Noem and Stephen Miller have been saying, is that anybody who makes the choice to bring a gun to a protest, all bets are off then. And I have to say, that's not what they were saying at January 6th. And remember January 6th, before Trump gave his speech, and he was so angry because the crowd wasn't big enough, and somebody said to him, well, they're having trouble getting through the metal detectors because they're all carrying. And Trump said, let them all in. They don't want to shoot me. Right? So his attitude toward this has always been, the gun owners are all on my side. Now it appears that's not the case. And it's something that really, I think, requires a great deal more research. I think what you said about Petti carrying the gun because he works in a hospital really resonates. I don't know if any of the campuses you ever taught on, Neil, had a shooting, but there was a shooting on Wesleyan's campus shortly after the shooting at Virginia Tech, which was really the first huge campus shooting since the University of Texas sniper back in the 1960s. And it was terrifying. It was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. A woman was murdered by somebody who had been stalking her, which was horrifying to begin with. But the second thing was that nobody knew what had happened to the shooter. The Middletown police were so profoundly incompetent that the shooter just sort of slipped away. Nobody knew why it had happened. They didn't know where the shooter had gone. And so we all spent a day in lockdown, just terrified. And I remember afterwards, a friend of mine who used to play in the NFL, and we'd gone to college together, and he was a big gun owner. And he came over and he said, Claire, I need to take you out. We need to buy a gun that you're comfortable with, and I'll teach you to shoot it, and I'll help you get a license. And I said, I don't know if I can do that. And he said, you are in one of the most dangerous professions there is. And of course, working in a hospital, and a VA hospital at that, of course, yes, the idea that there is imminent danger probably felt very real. Who knows how many of the nurses in that hospital are carrying?
Yeah.
So anyway, I wanted to close this segment, Neil, by mentioning Bruce Springsteen's new protest song. I think it's all over the place, but I'm including a link to it. It's called Streets of Minneapolis. It is vintage Springsteen, I think. My wife and I were both in tears. The only other Springsteen song I cry over is The Rising, which I can't listen to it without crying because it's about 9/11. But I'd like to urge our listeners to go to the Political Junkie Substack and listen to the song, or Google it on YouTube and listen to it. It is a profoundly moving song. Woody Guthrie would be so proud of Bruce. Yeah. So, Neil, what do you want to go viral this week?
All right. What I want to go viral is this piece that ran just a day or so ago in the Los Angeles Times. The headline of it is, LA is ripping up 1,600 acres of pavement, but is it too little, too late? This is from Devin Provo. It's in their Voices, so their op-ed section. Full disclosure, I know Devin. I had like a tiny role in this piece coming to be. But that said, I want to speak about the piece, which uses this really interesting news event from just a month or so ago. At the end of the year, at the end of 2025, LA County adopted a new target to remove and replace 1,600 acres of pavement and to replace it with green infrastructure, so trees, plants, rain gardens by 2045. This is part of their ongoing sustainability plan. In doing so, LA County is joining a growing number of cities particularly Portland and Chicago, I think, are getting the most attention about this. But other cities worldwide, including, I believe, like Paris and some cities in Asia, that are ditching pavement specifically to respond to ecological vulnerabilities. There's all this sort of research that shows that pavement, particularly excess pavement in cities, drives so many of the challenges of our climate era, including, worsening heat and increasing flooding and all the rest. And that there's this movement, if we pull up pavement, especially when it's not really being used and it's not essential, we can allow the earth to do its own sort of regeneration that is fundamental to attacking climate change. And so that's sort of what the piece is about. But Devin makes this really provocative argument that it's like not enough to rip up pavement, that we actually have to invest in that vegetation. And we have to treat vegetation, trees, soil, vegetation, water systems as city workers, and that they deserve pay. And we don't just like invest in infrastructure, but that we are, as we've known it, gray infrastructure or hard infrastructure, but that cities must also invest in living infrastructure. They have to do the pruning and the caretaking of the work of these places, of these natural elements, so that they too might be part of a city's budget and a city's planning, and that they might also be treated as sort of essential workers. And so there's a sort of tongue-in-cheek to this piece, but also a really serious point that the investment has to be towards these living systems that also require care, that also require investment and caretaking in order for them to do their work. So anyway, read the piece. Again, it's in the LA Times. It's called "LA is Ripping Up 1,600 Acres of Pavement, but is it too little too late?" The piece's argument is no, it's not too little too late if we make the right sort of investments in the future into these green systems.
Wow, that sounds amazing. It's one of the things that is so tragic about the Trump administration is that there will be all of these local initiatives moving forward, and somebody needs to be cataloging them and putting them together and sharing knowledge, because, I remember the recent floods in Los Angeles. Part of that is because there's so much pavement that there's nowhere for the water to go.
Right.
Once the systems get overwhelmed, there's nowhere to go. Here in Northampton, there is a cooperative food store, which is kind of a classic cooperative food store. And they have sheds over the parking lot with solar panels on them. And I said to the guy who designed them, who's a guy that I row with, that's so smart, is to use that for energy. He said, oh no, it gets better than that, because when you cover the parking lot, then the asphalt doesn't absorb the heat in the summer and reflect it back into the environment. So you're actually capturing the sun and not allowing it to heat, just turning it straight into electricity.
Exactly. Yeah. There's so many different, this piece sort of speaks to that. There's so many sort of small acts that can actually add up to really big transformative change. And it's starting to happen in a lot of cities around the world. Fortunately, some cities also in the US. So we'll continue to follow the story.
That's fantastic, Neil. Thanks so much. So my viral item this week is Katie Benner and Erica L. Green's new book about T.M. Landry College Prep in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana. It's called Miracle Children, Race, Education, and a True Story of False Promises. Now, people who are on YouTube all the time might remember from like 10 or 15 years ago, these videos started appearing of young people, mostly Black, watching a computer. And this is when they started letting kids know their admissions decisions by you would log in and you would see whether you were accepted or not. And so there would be this very sort of pregnant moment where everybody, all the kids are wearing these Ivy League t-shirts and carrying pennants and stuff like that. And then the kid gets into college, starts jumping up and down and screaming and yelling. Okay, this was T.M. Landry. And it was a couple, Mike Landry and his wife, who ran a school in Breaux Bridge, was unaccredited, but apparently this is not unusual in Louisiana. Louisiana's educational landscape is just a heartbreak and became more of a heartbreak after Hurricane Katrina. And the Landrys basically conned a lot of parents into believing that they and only they could get their children into college. And not just any college, but Harvard, Yale, Wesleyan, Vassar, and so on. And in fact, the Landrys seemed to have a fair amount of success getting these kids into college. But it turned out it was all a lie. And Landry, parents would sometimes say, well, why don't we get report cards? And Mike Landry would say, well, that's not how I work. I work through mastery. And, and the parents would say, well, why don't our kids sort of take normal courses? Why are they all just sort of like schooling themselves? And Landry would say, well, it's my system. They achieve mastery by working things out themselves and helping each other and so on and so forth. I won't give away the whole thing, but the school turned out not just to be a sham, but a tragic, tragic sham. Landry was abusing the children physically, which again is not uncommon in Louisiana, apparently. You can, in fact, hit children in school, but he would choke them. He would force them to sit in the center of a circle while other students mocked them. And all the students ever did was study for the ACT. And so when they started to apply to college, Landry would send these transcripts that were completely fake, saying that these kids, were in like advanced Mandarin when they never studied a word of Chinese, saying that the school had, future girls in tech club that the students were members of didn't exist. And what was also true is the Landrys isolated these children. They weren't allowed to hang out with other kids. They had to give up all of their friends from the schools they came from. They weren't allowed to talk to their parents. And maybe the saddest part is the parents. As I say, they were almost 100% Black. A lot of them middle class, upper middle class people who could not bear how badly their children were being treated in school. And there are a number of kids in the book who went to public schools that treated them badly, then went to private schools that treated them badly, then went to Christian schools that treated them badly. And they ended up at Landry because they believed that Mike Landry cared about their children, because he said over and over again that he did. And instead, he abused them and set a lot of them up for failure when they got into these very great schools. There's one young woman who gets into Wesleyan, and I think it was after I was there. I think I had left by then. But he made all these connections with deans of admissions that then began to come to him and say, who do you have for me this year? But he also played the kids off against each other. Like there was one kid who wanted to go to Brown, and then Landry comes to him one day and says, well, you didn't do well enough on your ACT, so I'm giving the Brown spot to someone else. It's just a horrifying story. But it's not a horrifying story about just one person. It's a horrifying story about race in America. The essays that the kids had to write, as I say, they often came from these very nice middle-class families, and the kids would have to write a whole fake story about how their father was a drug addict and homeless on the streets of New Orleans, and, their mother had died, and, and what Mike Landry would say is white people don't actually want to know who you are. This is who they want you to be. I'm still wrapping my head around what this says about racism in America, but that it gave this man, a Black man, the tools to use and abuse so many children and their parents is just heartbreaking. Louisiana, as far as I can tell, is a cesspool when it comes to education, but they're not the only one, and education isn't working well for Black people anywhere. So it's really worth reading just to sort of spark people's interests in the midst of this terrible climate where affirmative action and DEI has been permanently dismantled. What are we supposed to do about the inequalities that racism produces in the outcomes for children who, if they had had a good education, could have succeeded at any of these schools?
Sounds like an incredible work of reporting.
Yeah, it is an incredible work of reporting, and it springs off of a New York Times investigation into the Landrys, and they wrote it up as a book.
That's what I was going to say. I felt like I'd read a shorter version of this, but sounds like the book probably just has so much more reporting in it and really expands the story.
Yeah, and it's a really good read. So, Neil, I think that's it until next week. We'll know next week how few tickets Melania has sold.
Cannot wait to hear.
Cannot wait to hear. And I can't wait to see you again next week, Neil.
All right, same.